All right, let's finish chapter 13. Even though she was surrounded by so many women, the next 2 days were the loneliest of Corrie's life. Lonelier than when she had been up by herself in Scheveningen. She felt numb. Tears streamed across her cheeks, and she was lost in her thoughts. Instead of their being free before the new year, Betsy was dead. How could it be? And as if her grief at losing Betsy weren't enough, a terrible rumor that all women over 50 were soon to be exterminated made its way around the barracks. According to the rumor, Ravensbrück was running out of food to feed all the prisoners, so it had been decided to reduce the number of prisoners in the camp by gassing the older ones. When Corrie heard this, despite her grief, she was glad Betsy had gone to be in a better place. On December 17th, 1944, 3 days after Betsy's death, the morning roll call went as usual, that is, until dismissal. The whistle blew, and then, "Ten boom! Cornelia! Remain behind!" bellowed through the loudspeaker. Corrie started to march away with the others. Even though she had heard the announcement, she had been number 66730 for so long that she hardly recognized her own name. Slowly the words sank in, and she stopped marching. They had called her by name. Names were never used in Ravensbrück. She tried to think what it could mean. What could the Nazis want with her now? Had someone reported her for visiting Betsy in the hospital? Or for holding Bible studies in the barracks? Corrie didn't know. But whatever it was, she hoped she'd be able to sit down soon. In the past few weeks, her legs had become so swollen, and the skin was stretched so tight across them that it stung when she stood. "Follow me," barked a guard. Corrie did her best to keep up. She followed the guard all the way to the camp administration building. Once inside, Corrie was motioned to sit on a long wooden bench with 9 other prisoners. An officer was sitting opposite them behind a large desk. He had piles of papers in front of him, which he kept moving from side to side. Eventually, he looked up and called, "Ten boom! Cornelia, step up to the desk." Corrie got painfully to her feet and shuffled over to his desk as she had been ordered. "Birthday?" he asked. Corrie had to think hard for a moment. "April 15th, 1892, she finally replied. "Good," the officer said as he pulled a large rubber stamp from the top drawer of his desk. He rubbed it on an ink pad several times and then thumped it down on the piece of paper in front of him. Then he handed the paper to Corrie and called the next name. Corrie stepped back from the desk and stared at the paper. The rubber stamp had printed "discharged" in red ink on the page. Could it possibly be true? After all she'd been through, could she really be going home? Home to Nolly and Willem in the Bay? She looked around in wonder. Would this really be her last day in this terrible place? "Follow me," commanded another guard, and Corrie was led into the next room. "Clothes over there. Final health check," said the guard as she pointed to a pile of prison dresses on the floor. Corrie quickly took her clothes off and joined the group of naked women sitting at the far end of the room. They sat together and waited. Each of them held a piece of paper similar to Corrie's, but no one spoke. The women were all deep in their own thoughts. At first, Corrie was thrilled to be free, but then she began to think the whole thing might be a trap. Maybe they were really on their way to the gas chamber. She had heard that the Nazis played tricks like that so the prisoners would go quietly and unsuspectingly into the chamber. "Through the door," motioned the guard. All of a sudden, Corrie could not move. She was too scared. What if there was a gas chamber on the other side of the door? Corrie saw panic on some of the other prisoners' faces, but since she had no choice but to obey, slowly she stood up and walked with the other women towards the door. To her relief, on the other side was a young man in a doctor's coat. "Stand against the wall," he told the women. The women obeyed. "Bend over, touch your toes," he commanded. "Now, stand up straight," he barked, and then walked along the row of women. He looked each woman up and down. "Passed," he said 3 times. Then he stopped at Corrie. He looked down and then said flatly, "Swollen legs, hospital." Corrie hurried along behind a trustee. "Is it true I've been released?" she asked. The trustee looked at her kindly and said, "Yes, if you have the paper, you are released, but they won't let you go until you're well enough." Corrie frowned. The trustee went on. The Nazis won't release prisoners who aren't healthy. They're scared it might look as though they didn't look after them properly. Corrie nearly laughed out loud. She'd been starved, beaten, and forced to work 12 hours a day, and every day in Ravensbrück she had had to smell the burning bodies of women who had been gassed to death, and now they wouldn't release her because she had swollen legs? It made no sense at all. The trustee led Corrie into the back of the hospital and spoke to the nurse. Corrie was given a top bunk against the wall. As she settled down on the bunk to think about the day's strange turn of events, she kept her legs propped up high against the wall. Swollen legs were the only thing that separated her from freedom. Each morning, Corrie got into a lineup of released prisoners, and each morning the same thing was written on her paper. Swollen legs, return for treatment. Corrie would return to her bunk and keep her legs elevated some more. The hospital had been a grim place when Betsy was brought to it, but now it had become a place of complete horror. A trainload of prisoners being transferred to Ravensbrück had been bombed by the Allies. Many of the women were badly hurt. Some were missing arms and legs. The women screamed in agony through the night while the nurses mocked them and laughed at their pain. The bunks in the hospital were also so hopelessly overcrowded that during Corrie's first night there, 4 women rolled off the bunks to their death. But Corrie decided that the women worst off in all of Ravensbrück were the women who lined up with her each morning for inspection. Like her, they knew they would be free to go if they just got well enough. But even Corrie could see some of them would never be well enough. They were yellow with jaundice or coughed up blood, a sure sign of tuberculosis. Corrie felt so sorry for them. How cruel it was for them to have freedom dangling just out of their reach. Finally, on December 28th, 10 days after entering the hospital, Corrie heard the words she'd been waiting to hear. Past inspection. With those 2 words from the doctor, Corrie's whole world changed. Instead of returning to her bunk in the hospital or to Barracks 28, she was whisked through another set of doors and into a hallway. A trustee showed her into a small room where racks of recycled women's clothes hung in neat rows. Find something that fits. I'll be back in a minute, said the trustee. Corrie stared at the racks. Had she heard right? Did she get to choose for herself? She'd been told what to do, where to sit, what to eat, and when to talk every day for the 10 months she'd been in prison. And now she's being told to choose for herself? She was still standing there when the trustee came back. Come on, said the trustee, let me help you. Together they found a woolen skirt, a silk blouse, a hat and coat, and a good pair of lace-up shoes. Corrie had to leave the laces of the shoes undone as her feet were still too swollen, but she tried to walk as if her feet were normal. There, you look wonderful, said the trustee as she led Corrie from the room to a desk where she was handed a pen. Sign this, said a guard, thrusting a piece of paper in front of her on the desk. Corrie read what was written on the paper. It was a statement in German saying that the person signing had been treated well at Ravensbrück and had never been ill, never been hungry, and never been hurt. Her signature on the page was now all that stood between Corrie and freedom. Quickly, she signed the paper. Next, she was given a slice of bread and a free train pass to get to the Dutch border. Last, a guard pulled a large manila envelope from a file cabinet and handed it to Corrie. With trembling hands, Corrie began to open the envelope. What could it possibly be? As she tore open the top of the envelope, out tumbled her mother's wedding ring, her gold watch, and the Dutch guilders she'd had in her dress pocket when the Gestapo raided the Bayeux. It seemed like a lifetime ago. Move along, said the guard, pointing towards the double doors at the end of the room. Corrie walked through them as she put on her wristwatch. She found the watch and held it to her ear. It still ticked. In the next room, she joined 10 other women, all dressed in recycled clothes and clipping on watches, slipping on rings, and doing up necklaces. Corrie thought they looked like a bunch of ladies getting ready for church. Except for one thing. They were all so thin that no matter how many clothes they had on, one could easily still see the outline of their bones. Another guard walked in. We're leaving, she announced as she swept through the room. The women glanced at each other and then followed her out the door into the cold December morning. They followed her right up to the huge iron gates of Ravensbrück. The guard yelled a few words at the gatekeepers, and the gates swung open. Freedom! Is it real, or was it a trick? Corrie kept asking herself over and over as she walked through the gates, up over the rise and down the railroad track to a small train station. As she sat at the station waiting for a train to arrive, a terrible thought struck her. She might be free, but was she any safer outside Ravensbrück than she'd been inside? She was near Berlin, deep inside Germany, right in the middle of a war zone. How would she ever make it safely back to Holland? And that's the end of chapter 13.